G'day, Akemi here. So, when I started doing stencils, I was doing single layer black stencils. Now, these interested me. They're sort of like visual haiku, in that single layer black stencil is very much a Rorschach blot where we all see the same image. And I really enjoy that as an art form because it involves the viewer. They're creating the image, which is awesome. And for me, it comes from looking at the Sumi ink style that Chinese calligraphers used and artists. An extraordinary style where you can see three lines, but those three lines give the image of a guy loading a big old bale of rice onto a boat on a windy day. Really evocative, strong stuff, but done so simply. And I think the reason it's evocative is because you bring so much to it yourself, which is really, really interesting because the process of individuation then decides how and what you take away from any given piece of art. But for me, I couldn't see value in what I was doing, the single layer stencils. And that's one of the things that you're never going to be able to see as an artist, how other people see and value your work. They might be able to tell you, but you're not going to be able to look at it through their fresh eyes. You're just going to see the mistakes and where you could have done better, and there are some pictures you're satisfied with where you go, hey, that looks good. But again, you're not going to be able to see it the way the audience does. So for me, not having that feedback of being the audience, which is impossible and too much to ask for anyway, because it's impossible, I wandered from that style. I moved on to doing many, many layers and stencils. And that's the journey. That's the journey. So I was developing the style. Black, red, and white was my thing for a while, and that came together very well. And then I moved on to full colour stencils. Now, full colour stencils taught me a lot. One of the greatest things it's taught me is how to use controlled underspray. If you look at the photograph of the finished product of this video, the left-hand side of the chest has a tone there across the skin where the top of the clothing casts a shadow. There's no other colours in that stencil than black and white. It's just the use of controlled underspray that gave me a tone shift. And that's something that I picked up on the way with the full colour stencils I was doing. I have never liked hard changes in colour in stencil art. And, that's me. I would prefer to have, like in nature, soft gradient fades. And I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't do that, given that you can very easily by using controlled underspray. And so I was producing work, and a lot of it was fairly personal. I mean, one of the things I can be proud to say is that every step of the way, I have made art about being me. And that's awesome, because it means the art is authentic. The art is probably more authentic than I am in person. Which, but that sort of wasn't what I enjoyed. It was taking the steam out of me, because with full colour stuff and, pursuing realism to some extent, even if it's a illustrative realism, I found myself in a position where I was comparing it to the Photoshop work that people produce with stencils. Now, right up front, for me, Photoshop stencils aren't where it's at. And it's not intended as an insult or a slight, and don't fucking jump up and down on your keyboard. This is for me and me alone, and I'm speaking of my experience. I want to have the smallest gap between my heart and the final product. And so I use the minimum number of tools I can. Black layer stencils, you use the minimum number of lines you can. It's the same sort of minimalist philosophy, and the reason I apply it, as I say, is so I produce the most authentic version of me I can. I don't feel I can do that with Photoshop. That's me. And I'm not terribly good at Photoshop. I've dabbled with it a little bit. The title card for this is generated in Photoshop. But, the journey I'm on, and this is speaking about my journey, and I'm going to say this so many times through this video, this is all about my experience and how I feel. It's not intended to convey any slight upon any approach you take. So, I decided after a while, well, maybe stencils aren't what I should be doing. Maybe I should be doing freehand. And, I've dabbled in freehand, and, for a while there, for probably 2 years, I didn't produce much art. Not much art at all. Now, I was going through a lot at the time. I was going through the process of individuation, burning myself down and building myself back up again. But I've been very fortunate in that through my art and through my friends, I came in contact with Blender. Now, Blender Studios is arguably the studio that really kick-started street art in Melbourne and Australia. Adrian Doyle's done fantastic work, never given enough credit. Also a really insightful person and artist, and he said to me at one point, you should go back to the well. Not in those exact words, but he was saying, go back to doing stencils. And whenever anyone would ask him what I did, he would say, Akemi is a stencil artist. And I sort of scratched my head and I'm not a stencil artist, I'm an artist. I do everything. Toys, freehand, fucking all of it. But the thing is, you can't do all of it. Nobody's got enough time in the day to put in the hours to get good at all of these things. So, make your life easier. Just pick one. And, when it comes to advice from people, oftentimes I poo-poo it and say, no, I know better than them. One of the fortunate things I have in that Doyle's a friend of mine is that I've got someone way smarter than me and way wiser than me telling me, hey, here's some information you should know. And, after a while I picked up on it. And, I was sort of concerned. This style I'm going back to, I feel, is unsophisticated. And I sort of started reflecting on what brought me to that single black layer style. And one of the artists that really moved me, and still does to this day, is an artist by the name of Yoji Shinkawa, a Japanese artist. Really, really good artist. Video game players might know him for the Metal Gear Solid work. He's a very distinctive art style. But when I look at his black and white work, just black and white, I feel it contains sophistication. I feel it contains style. And I think, personally, that's kind of the mountain when it comes to style. For someone to be able to look at your work and say, that's Billy Bloggs, straight away, just because of the way you make your lines, the weight of the lines, the marks, the way you don't put shadows, where you do, what techniques you use, the controlled underspray, all of that. And, one of the big things, too, with coming back to the single layer stencils, is the idea that if you want to develop taste, you have to trust your own tastes. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do, to trust your own tastes, especially if you have low self-esteem or you're not terribly confident with yourself. Two things that I struggle with. I probably suffer a bit from imposter syndrome too. Whole gamut of things. Those things are irrelevant. Just get in there and fucking do the hours. Because style is the accumulation of habits over time. And by practicing your style, your individual tastes will develop with your ability and will become your style uniquely. So consider it from the point of view of a martial art, like archery. Now, some of you know that I've got a bit of a background in archery. When you start, you're trained in the form, specific form, for very good reasons. It's a very effective form. Over the dickety years I did archery, and I was relatively successful, a bunch of national titles and records and all sorts of nonsense. But after, the dickety years, my technique became unique. It evolved. There were quirks to it that worked for me and probably for me alone. And I think the same thing is true of art. I really do. I think you've got to put in the hours. It's easy to think that, you've done a piece of work and you've arrived. But you haven't. The mountain is always going to be in the distance. And I think, if you're lucky, in a lifetime you might be able to get to the point where you can see it with a telescope. Now, in my journey to the mountain, I took up doing stencils again, and Doyle observed me using a brush pen. And he said, look, why don't you try using it as a brush? Which, I went away and said, because I was using a brush pen as a marker, and I thought, wow, that's a really good idea, because one of the things I've had trouble with looking at Yoji Shinkawa's work is seeing how he makes those marks, and picking up the brush pen, using it for this stencil, has changed my mark making. Now it's a small stencil. It was drawn A3 and reduced down to the size of a spray can, but that means that I can't capture all the brushstroke and detail of the brushstrokes I would like, but it still carries the soul of the brushstrokes, and I think that's enough. It does get tricky though when you're developing style, but I think the key to that is to enjoy what you do and let that enjoyment inform you of the direction you should take. The art form you can do that stops all the talking in your head, it's probably the direction you should go. Well, on top of that, I'll give you one more piece of advice, and this is the best thing you can ever do. This is the key to becoming good and successful at anything. Put in the hours. Just sit down and put in the hours. Okay, guys, that'll do for today. Thanks for listening. I really do appreciate it immensely. If you could drop a like, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications. But other than that, thanks for your times, guys. Appreciate it.